Howdy folks, I'm Mark. I make stuff, and today we're diving into part 4 of our Swatchity code along series. And today's topic is the feed, the Swatch feed. And if you're wondering what Swatchity is, and more importantly why it is, there's a link up there. You can click on that and get some context. Anyway, let's take a look at the user story for part 4. When a user visits the homepage, they should see a feed showing recent posts. If they're logged in, they'll see a subnab with other versions of the feed to view. For each item in the feed, the user can toggle a like button, and doing so will update the post stats and the author's stats. If logged in, the user can create a new post. If more posts are available, a load more button will appear to load more swatches. A refresh button is also available to clear loaded swatches and load again. If the user clicks the search icon in the main nav, they will be presented with a color picker and be redirected to the Swatch feed for that color. There's a lot going on in this particular feature. So let's take a look at what it looks like in the local when we're done. So here we have our feed. As you can see, we only have 3 items per page in this testing version. So we only have 3, and then we have our load more button here. We have different feeds we can look at. Our fresh feed is basically everything that's new. We have our liked feed. Since I'm not logged in, we're not seeing anything here. Let's log in real quick. So since I'm logged in, we can now see the swatches that I've liked. We have featured items here. These are items that have been liked by other users or have been replied to. We're going to get to replies later. And our mood. What qualifies as a moody color? It's based on an algorithm that tends to prioritize dark, highly saturated colors. That's about as far as it goes. So let's take a look at our fresh feed. You can see we have the skeletons that load in. When our new swatches load, we can like a swatch. I just liked my own swatch. Later on, we'll be able to reply to swatches. We can't currently do that. We have threads that you can go in and reply to them. So we also have the search feature here. I'm going to demo this in production because I think it works a little better in production. So we'll click on search, and we're going to look for this light blue color, because I know I have at least a couple of those. There they are. I wanted to start with our API routes, basically the back-end features, and then we'll work to the front-end features. In our API, we now have a folder for Swatch. So we have create swatch, read swatches, meaning we're looking up our feed, and set like swatch, which is what happens when we click that. And if we unclick it, we're going to be getting rid of a swatch-like record. So let's take a look at create swatch. So in here, you're going to see we have the same basic pattern we have other places. We look at the server session. We want to make sure that this is the same user that we expect to see. We're going to take the data that comes in, and we're going to check that against the create swatch rules that we talked about before. We're going to look up the user meta for the user who is submitting this swatch, so the author of the swatch. We're going to grab a color score. We talked about a color score. So right now it's just a function to give us a score for every swatch that is created. So now that we have the score, we have all the information we need to create a swatch. We have the color, we have the user ID. Notice that we wrap it in a string literal, so we know that if anything goes wrong, we know that this ID is, in fact, a string. We include the color score, we set the likes to 0, the replies to 0, and if everything works out okay and we have an extended swatch, then we return all that stuff. An extended swatch is basically the swatch information that's provided along with the user record, right? So we stuff that user information along with the swatch. That's an extended swatch. And we need that to present the swatches, right? We need the name, we need the username. So that's how this API endpoint works. The read swatches is very simple. This is what we use on the server side when we're doing server-side props for each of these feed pages. We're going to pass in the information for the user, just in case they're logged in. They don't have to be logged in to use this endpoint, but if they are logged in, we're going to return user likes as well as swatches. We take that user information, and then we use this function, which is at the center of all of this, getSwatchesDB. Now, this function is kind of lengthy because it handles all the different types of feeds that we support. So we have a search feed from the URL parameter. It's going to take in RGB, it's going to split that up, and that's what we're going to use. We're going to parse that as numbers, and then we're going to use that information to search. So MOE is our margin of error, right? 75 out of 255. So it's a fairly wide margin of error, but you know, because we're doing this for all three, it's actually much narrower than that 75 out of 255 would imply. Our mood, it's going to order them by the color score. That's all it really does, right? We did all the work by adding that color score to the swatch when we created it. So we're not doing any fancy math on the mood feed itself. Liked, basically, we're just saying, if the user's logged in, we're going to use their information to see if they've liked it. And we're only going to show swatches that they've liked. There may be more efficient, more performant ways of doing this. If you have a better idea, I would love to hear it. So let me know in the comments what you think about this. So for a feature, if it's at least liked once, then we're going to sort it by the number of likes. So we could sort it by the number of replies as well. I think maybe later on I make this a little more robust. And the feed is basically just sorting by created at. It's kind of simple in spite of the apparent complexity. Even though we have all the information, we still need to know, did the user like them? If this is the liked feed, we know these are all liked swatches, so we don't worry about it. But if it's a feed other than liked, then we're going to go in and grab anything where swatch like includes any of these swatch IDs that we collected through the course of this. And we're going to return a liked swatches as likes, right? We're going to return likes. And then we have set like swatch. Basically, this is a create like or delete like function, depending on whether that like already exists for this user and this swatch. We are checking to see Prisma swatch like count. So we're saying, does a swatch exist where the swatch ID matches and the user ID matches, right? And if it exists, then we remove it. We delete anything where that matches. It's the same where clause. And we use delete many just in case, for whatever reason, there were multiple ones that slipped through. Otherwise, we're going to create one similar to our create swatch. We swatch ID, user ID, and the author ID comes in on the data from the request. You'll notice that we also update the swatch stats, so num likes gets updated. And then you can see that we also update the user score. Now this function, we basically count all of the swatches a user has made, all of the likes for the swatches they've made. But you can see we take those two values, likes are 5 times more valuable than posts, and then we update the user meta to accommodate that, right? So we set the score, and just in case they leveled up, or in fact leveled down, we update the user level. This array here represents the breaks. We go through the breaks and we say if our score is more than this, then our level is this, all the way down through there. And once that's returned, then we update that, and that's how that works. So one of the ways we get around some of the limitations with NoSQL databases is we do some of the work while people are doing things. So rather than doing the work during the query, we're doing the work during creation or updating things while activities happen. So if I like something, I'm actually updating data on the swatch itself. I'm creating a record for the like. I'm updating the user's score or level. So there's a lot happening behind the scenes to avoid having to run heavy calculations during the runtime. Or at least that's the intent, right? So that's how the API functions work. Let's take a look at the pages. So our old index page had a layout, wrapper, and then just some placeholder information. This one's quite a bit different. Because we reuse the feed functions on multiple pages, we have a reusable component called SwatchFeed where we can send in information like the title key, the intro key, and the feed so that we can mold this to our purposes for the different feed pages that you saw up here, right? All of these. Notice that we say initial swatches and initial likes, because once I like something, then not only the database data is mutated, but my local store of that data is mutated. So these really are initial likes when they load from the server-side rendering. So in server-side props, we derive our initial swatches and our initial likes, right? And we grab that from getSwatchesDB, which we just looked at. So we know what that does, right? So we send it the feed as the feed type, which means it's the home page essentially. And we send it 0 because we want to start from the beginning. And we send it the session because we want to know who's logged in so we can check those likes, right? So swatch data that comes back includes the likes and the swatches. And we call it initial likes here. And then our initial swatches, we run something called serialized swatch dates. And the reason we do that is that we're storing our dates as actual dates. When we send this data back to the page component as a prop, it needs to serialize that, and it can't always do that without some help. So we're using functions like serialize swatch dates so that we can make sure that this data with dates will not break. There's probably a smarter way of doing this. I could probably build some middleware that would avoid having to do this. And maybe that's an improvement for the future. But as you can see, our get server-side props, we are going to pass these back to the component. That's what we have, and you can see our types, right? So we have extended swatch, that's a regular swatch with the user data, and it's an array of that, right? And the same thing for swatch likes. So swatch likes, these are just IDs, string IDs in an array. So that is just so we can tell, has the user clicked like on this or not? That's all that's for. So we pass that into SwatchFeed. What's going on in SwatchFeed? Well, you already know that it has the layout component in there, right? And there it is, right? So the JSX is more or less what you would expect. We have our layout component here. We have, we are passing in this thing called header buttons, which you haven't seen before. But header buttons is where we are passing in our refresh and our new swatch. And we're passing it in so that we can have all this separation, but we can specify what we want those functions to do, right? So our header buttons is a fragment with this button, and if they're logged in, this other button. And subnav data is where we get this subnav area right here, right? And our intro text and our title text, that gets internationalized. You can see we just have page title and page intro. We're using format message to do that, right? So we're using that title key and the intro key that were sent to us through our props. So we have all of this, and then we have the actual feed itself, the swatch posts. The swatch post component, we're going to go over that in a second, but our swatches. Now you'll notice it says swatches here and not initial swatches. We use initial swatches to populate our use state instance, which is an array of type swatch extended, right? And then as we add swatches, if I create a swatch, we're just going to add it here rather than requerying the database. Now, if I hit refresh, we're going to use a function like load swatches, right? We could also use it for loading more. So you'll notice we have load more pagination down here. Load more is going to do the same thing, but it's going to say load swatches with an SK, which are skip, right? If I'm refreshing my swatches, I set load swatches skip 0, and then load more swatches, my skip is set to the length of the array, meaning send me the next ones. This kind of pagination is really common with NoSQL databases, but we didn't have to do it this way, but it was very comfortable to do it this way. We have conditional rendering for special cases like skeletons, which we saw earlier. We have no search results or you need to be logged in. Now, you wouldn't see you need to be logged in if we were on search, but you definitely would see you need to be logged in if you were on the liked feed. And here's the load more, but we only see load more if can load more is true. How do we set can load more? Can load more is based on, it's a useState instance, a Boolean, that is default set to true, but you'll notice that we set it to false if I load swatches and the number of swatches that we load is 0, then we know there are no more swatches to load. And then down here, there's the star of the show, the color picker. We went over that last time, so we were not going to be talking about this time, but this is what gets used. So it was very important when I was building this to make sure the color picker, even though it's not being shown, doesn't have focusable items when it's not being displayed, because we actually display it in multiple spots. So once it's live, we can tab through it once it's live, but we can't tab through it when it's not, right? So it doesn't interrupt the tab order when it's not actually available. So that is what the Swatch feed does. There's quite a bit going on here. We could take a look at these other feed pages. So our index is the main feed, the home page, right? We call that the feed. And then we have featured, and boy, it looks like the same thing, right? Because we're reusing a lot of components here, right? So we have our Swatch feed here as well, liked, Swatch feed. We're using a different feed type to feed into this stuff. We're using a different title key and all that stuff, but it's essentially the same stuff. We're able to reuse a lot of code here. So let's take a look at the individual Swatch post. This particular component has a lot of interactivity in it. In production, we'll be able to click on through this to a thread based on this swatch. We'll cover that in a later user story, but that's the idea. We have our like, we have our thread, we have the information here. We also have this. This is the user's avatar, the author's avatar, that when we click through will send us to that author's page. That's actually the next story we're going to work on. Let's start with the JSX here. We have the avatar, which you see here. We're using our homegrown atomic CSS to position everything. We're using this thing called time since, right? Time since is a component that we use to tell us how long has it been since this thing happened. You see this a lot on Twitter and some other social media networks. Instead of saying this happened on a specific date, we're saying this happened so many minutes, hours, days, years ago, which cleans up the design quite a bit. You can see how little space it takes up to say this happened 35 minutes ago. You'll notice we have our SVG here. This SVG is just for the corner, this corner here. When you look at it in the inspector, you'll see that it's actually a square that's slightly expanded to cover what could be bits of this blue popping through, right? And we have a calculated color based on this color, and then we have the background color. Whether you're in dark mode or light mode, right? This color will change. And that's really all there is to it. I was originally going to make this as an expandable SVG, but of course, as you can probably guess, the aspect ratio of this corner kept changing, and I hated that so very much. So there's really no reason to do that. We could just do this, and that works out well. So that color that I mentioned, that complementary color, is based on get corner color, right? So we're passing in the red, the green, and the blue of the swatch. They're sent in as separate colors, get corner color. We do the RGB to HSV. We talked about this last time. This RGB to HSV is such a critical function. So thank you, Stack Overflow. This is so critical, taking that color, turning it into our HSV. And then what we can do is we can make the value, make it darker or lighter based on how light it is to begin with, right? So if it's brighter than 60%, it's 60 of 100. So if it's brighter than 60%, then we're going to go 30% darker than its original color Otherwise, we go 30% lighter than its original color. So that's what we're doing. It's really just doing a value check, but it looks like there's more to it. It's really not. It's very simple. So we have our icons here. Notice that once I click like, the like icon becomes filled. It doesn't just change color, it becomes filled. And that's because we have our icon components have a filled prop, right? So most of the time filled is false or it's just not used. But if we like it, then we fill it. So if is liked, we fill it, right? And then we have conditional color classes here as well. So let's take a look at how search works. So as I mentioned, when you click the search button, you get this. It'll send you to the search page with a specific route. So our R is 64 of 255, 130 of 255, you get it, right? So obviously our blue is very, very high. So that's why it's very blue. This is our search color. And we can see these are colors that, according to the algorithm, are sort of similar. You can see where, like, hue-wise, they're not quite the same. But these are all based on the individual RGB channels. And so if we click on this, we can search again. Of course, we could always click down here as well. You can see that it uses this RGB parameter here, splits it up, then uses that on the API route to deliver us a list of initial swatches from the get server side props. And that's really all there is to it. So we saw those skeletons. I'm going to refresh the page. Actually, let's go to fresh. And we're going to refresh the page, and you're going to see those skeletons again. It takes longer in dev, so we're going to refresh it. Just for a moment, you saw those skeletons. They pulse a little bit and that kind of thing. The way you would expect a skeleton to be. It's a lot of the same classes we use in the real Swatch post, but without the data, and then we have some specific skeleton classes that we use. This is using a module. Like I said, we don't use a lot of SCSS modules in this application. Mostly it's Atomic CSS, but this really warranted some highly customizable CSS. Another thing that we added for this was the session loader. And you could see that just for a second, we saw that logo mark pop up and kind of pulse a little bit in the center of the screen. We just use that to distract the user and to cover things up as we're reading the session and figuring out who you are if you're logged in. As far as tests are concerned, we have some more fixtures now. We have a mock swatch, as well as our mock user data. Under common, we have our SwatchFeed test. You can see that we have to mock more items here, our user context, our router. We have to mock the router, so for search and things like that, our authentication. So we have to mock quite a bit to get things working. But then we're also simulating certain actions like creating a new color, things like that. We're doing that all in here with React Test Library. As you can see in this story, we've done quite a bit. We have all of these feeds ready for people to use. We have our home page, we have our search, but these three items in the middle we haven't done. So those are going to be our focus on the next few stories. In fact, let's take a look at our next story is the author page. So in production, I can maybe show you a little better. So we're going to click on a different user, and we can see their profile. We can see all of the posts we made. Eventually, we'll be able to click on through this post to be able to reply to this swatch. We can also message this user with a color. All of that is coming up in the next few sessions. It's very exciting. There's a lot we've gotten done, but still a lot more to do. So I hope to see you then.